Music theory with OneNote. Inverted modal distance, finishing the clockwise lap around the track versus inverted intervals, return trip. Get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with OneNote, it's a beautiful note. Not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of the Modal Node System, MNS, presentation 1224, OneNote, inverted modal distance, finish lap versus inverted intervals, return trip. We have the list of presentations on the right, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also note that within this OneNote presentation, we could spend all of our time focusing in on music theory, but we have a similarly numbered and named presentation as well, where we build these tables in Excel, practicing our music skills, our Excel skills, and our table visualization at the same time. We're going to be continuing to look at our interval notation, this time thinking about directionality, which is a very vexing problem for many people. I'm sure you've run into it. I'm sure this has caused you problems, even if you're not aware of it. Let's get our analogy in place before we get into it, because remember, the terminology is going to get a little wonky here, particularly when we're going in a negative direction. Therefore, we don't want the terms to throw us off from our end goal. Remember the objective. What's our objective? I would say for most people, it's to be able to visualize the fretboard, navigate it as cleanly and easily as possible. To do that, I need to have directionality terms that are as clear as possible. Unfortunately, the ones that we use are not as clear as possible. Therefore, I need to be able to use the terms we have in a way that's efficient, even though they might be like talking to a sneaky lawyer or sneaky professor or something that basically insinuates things that pulls you out of the optimal way to visualize the fretboard. Don't let that happen. Stay focused. Stay focused. What is the best way to visualize the fretboard? Well, it's a map of the territory. It basically is a territory. It's got 7 destination continent type locations, comparing it to a globe. It's got 5 non-continent locations, which I'm going to say are the oceans. Those are the ones that we go through to get to the destination continent locations, of which there are only 7. Our head is up here in space, over the fretboard, over this low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, and we visualize the fretboard spinning around like the world is spinning around, assigning it 12 different degrees of rotation, which we label based on the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. We're typically going to be working on the 4th degree of rotation, which we call the collection of notes around the C major scale, but that's just a convention. We could go to the C sharp, we could go to the D sharp, and all of the relative positions would be the same. Just like you copied and paste, just like the continent planets rotating around don't change as you rotate it. Once you determine what degree of vision you're looking at, you no longer want to measure the fretboard primarily by the note names, but rather by the continent names, the things that don't change. And that would be similar to a Nashville number system if you use that, which is basically a modal system, just replacing the modal names with numbers. So the 1 is the Ionian, the 4 is a Lydian, the 3 is the Phrygian, the 6 is the Aeolian, and so on and so forth. Now the problem is that our naming conventions are based on scale degrees. Scale degrees are kind of measurement tools that are off by 1. Right? That's the problem. So it forces us to kind of think that we need to rename certain continent positions because of the tool being used that should simply be directionality. So let's think about that for a second down here. If we had our globe down here, we have all of our continents. So notice down here, I can go across the middle and so on and so forth. So I might get from North America to Asia by doing multiple different things. I can go around this way, or I can go straight across, and so on and so forth. But in our analogy, we can take the string here and imagine we wrap it around in a circle. So we only have a lap. We have a racetrack. It's an oval. We can only go around one way. We can only go around it. We could go around directionality, however. So although I can't go through the middle here, I could go clockwise and I could go counterclockwise. So if you were to construct a system of a map that is built like a racetrack, then the directionality terms that you need is either it's going forward or it's going backwards, and then the units of distance, which in our case are going to be notes, or it could be the 7 notes, which would be the modal half steps, the continents versus the continents and the oceans. That's all you need. I don't need to say, hey, look, take a left at the gas station, take a right at the school. No, because I'm on a racetrack. All you could do is go around clockwise, or you can go around counterclockwise. Now later we will add the idea of octaves, because there is such a thing as octaves, so it is more complex in that when you keep on going around clockwise, you're also going up pitch-wise. You're going up octave-wise. So the pitch is the same, or it's the same key, but it's also getting higher in the pitch. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. Right now, we're just visualizing it as a racetrack, and we're going to introduce the idea that we can go around the racetrack to the right, and we can also go around to the left. So the analogy, we're on the 2 here. We name that the 2 means South America. The name of it is 2 for us. And if I'm going to the 5, how far is that? I can go 1, 2, 3. It's 3 continents up. Or I can name this as the 1, which makes me rename it, which isn't proper for a measurement tool, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. That would make it the 4th. Or I can name the oceans as well. So now I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 5 up. That would be equivalent to the notes or the half steps that would be up. But that's not the only thing I could do. I could go backwards. I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, -4 modal half steps backwards. Now, you would think that that would be, if I made this the 1, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, -5th scale degree backwards. But we don't usually do negative scale degrees. That's the problem. We don't really have directionality in the current system. And part of the reason for that is because it's clear that it becomes a mess because the measurement was off, right? So let me show you what I mean. If what we have is we have our collection of notes up here. We have 12 notes in the musical alphabet. We're going to be picking the notes in the key of C. That's going to be our collection of 7 notes by applying our formula from the C, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, and then half step back home. Here are our 7 notes. Now, if we are in the key of C, we can apply the scale degrees of 1 through 7, right, to those collection of notes. Now, if I go from the Ionian to the Phrygian, I would like to say that's going to be 1, 2, 2 modal half steps up, 2 continents up. But they usually call it 1, 2, 3, the 3rd scale degree. Why is that a problem? Well, in our case, what if I want to go backwards? So what if I'm on this 1 and I want to go backwards? What would I call that from a scale degree terminology? If I went counterclockwise, you would think it would be 1 step counterclockwise or 1 negative step. And from a scale degree, if you make this the 1, I would think that would be a -2nd scale degree, because this is the 1 that would be -2. But we can't really do a -2nd scale degree, in part because the inverse doesn't really make sense, because you would think there are 7 scale degrees. So you would think if I went -1 step backwards, 7 minus 1 would be like 6 steps forward. But that's not, it doesn't exactly work, right? And also, if I apply the terminology of the intervals of the majors and minors and so on, I'm going to get a whole different pattern of intervals of major, minor, and perfects, which again is just a complete mess, because we kind of shoehorn these major, minor, and perfect into place going clockwise based on the major scale, instead of using like a 1.5 scale degree and so on and so forth. We used the minor as like the 0.5, right, kind of thing. So the problem happens is it's a complete mess when I go in the negative direction. So and we can address, so what I want to do then is try to use the current terms, but realize that's a problem. So in other words, like if I'm on this G, which is the 5, and I'm going up to the C, how far is that? From notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes up. That would be including like the oceans and the continents. If I went just up by continents, it would be 1, 2, 3. I would call those modal half steps up. But if I make a scale degree, it makes this the 1 instead of having it as the 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it would be the fourth scale degree. So that I would call that a 5 note away then, and we usually call it a perfect fourth. 5 note away, perfect fourth. But what if I'm measuring from the C going backwards to the G? Well, now what's the distance? I counted out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's -5, right? It's a -5 distance. But what am I going to call the -5 distance? I can't, it's not normal to call it -5. What people will normally do is take what we say is the inverse. So I'm going to recognize that it's -5 back, but I'm going to take the inverse, which is 12 minus 5, which would be 7. And so a 7 note away distance is going to be a perfect fifth. So if it's so I'm going to recognize that it's actually -5 steps back, but I'm still going to call it the equivalent to a 7 note away perfect fifth, right? And so if I went, which makes sense if I went this way, right? If I went on this C right here and I went up, this is 5 notes between here, and then 6, 7 notes away to get to this G. That makes sense. So in other words, it's kind of like I can keep going around the block to get to the same place on clockwise rotation, or I can go backwards. So if I'm on this 2 and I go up, including the oceans 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get a distance of 5 to get to this one here, right? So then I could go back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, -5, or I can keep taking the lap around the block. So I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I can go 7 around. Our current naming convention is always named kind of like as though we're going clockwise around the system, right? Now, so that's one way that you can see it. Now, the benefit of that, one thing that you could argue is, well, that's good because that means that there's only going to be one distance name that always gets you from one note to the other. So in other words, if I go from the C to the G, it's always going to be a 7 note away, which would be a perfect fifth. Even if I go this way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, well, it's obviously -5, but still, I use the same term, which is a perfect fifth. So the perfect fifth is the only thing that could get you then from like a C or an Ionian to the Mixolydian. And you can say, okay, I guess you can argue that, but it's not correct, right? Because we're not actually going forward. We're kind of thinking of it directionality like we're going backwards. We're going down in pitch. So I think the practical thing to do is to actually say that like a 7 note away perfect fifth, I would remember it as a perfect fifth is either going 7 forward or -5. So by default, if someone says it's a perfect fifth, I would imagine I'm going forward, but I can also then think forward 7, but I can also think it could be back 5. That will give you directionality, which again is something that a lot of guitarists just abandoned completely. We just start thinking in terms of shape, and we're like, say, this is too complicated because we have more than one string. That makes it complicated, and because the terminology is messy. Now, we also have octaves that we can put into play. We'll talk more about that later, but that's another reason why, of course, directionality is important. I need to know, am I going forward? Is it a perfect fifth going forward? Or is it a perfect fifth going backwards, right? And I'd also like to know the total distance. So later on, I can also say, well, what if I'm going from this C down to this G? It's like 7 notes away here, but this is going to be a different distance all the way down to here because it's going to be an octave higher, right? It's not in the same octave. So I'll talk more about that later. Again, that's another thing, particularly on the guitar, that we're not good at addressing. We're just going to call all of that whenever I go from the C to the G. I don't care if it's here or if it's there, or if it's there, it's there. I'm going to call it some kind of perfect fifth, right? A 7 note away perfect fifth. But obviously, sometimes I'm going backwards 5, and sometimes I'm going an octave up past the 7. How would I address that? Well, I would recommend you have directionality in your term and name the notes, meaning this one's going to be 12 plus 7, right? It's 7 plus an octave. Say that before you say it's a perfect fifth, and that'll help you to better understand the differences, right? And communicate it more clear. All right, we'll talk more about that later. Let's take a look at these and just go through them. So let's say that we have a 0 note away perfect first. So we're on a 0 note away perfect first. What's the inverse of a 0 note away perfect first? Well, it's obviously the same, because the perfect first means that we didn't go anywhere. That basically means we went 0 steps forward. And by the way, most people don't say 0, but I'm going to say the note distance all the time, because that's the most important thing about the measurement tool. So we didn't go anywhere. The perfect doesn't mean anything, right, either. Doesn't really help you out at all, because it doesn't tell you where the starting point is. So if you have the distance, the perfect doesn't really matter. But then you've got the first, which you know is off by 1. That's the distance we traveled from whatever note we happen to be measuring from, right? And we didn't travel anywhere because it's off by 1. It should be 0, right? It should be a 0 note away perfect 0, right? Okay, so then we're going to say that let's do this one. Let me undo that. Hold on a sec. So now we have a 1 note away, a distance of 1 note. We generally think clockwise, right? So we'd have a 1 note away minor second. So that would be something like if I was on the sea, that would land me in the ocean, right? But if I was on like the Phrygian, then I can go 1 step up. That distance, I can call that a 1 note away minor second. So what would be the inverse? What if I'm going then from this back to here? Well, then we would call that, then you would think, a negative 1 note away, right? But that's not normally what we do. We usually think as though we're going to continue going clockwise, 12 minus 1, which would be 11. And so even though I'm going back from here back to here, I'm going to call that then an 11 note away, which we then just have to know is a major 7. So we're going to add directionality when we get over here. Now, if I look at our modal distance term, what would we use it from a modal distance term? Well, let's look at one where we're going to be on the continents. If I was an Ionian to Ionian, that would land me in the ocean, right? I could think of the inverse as though I'm going from the ocean, which would be the I plus, right, in the ocean, to the I, but we don't typically do that, right? We're usually going to be using, this interval if I was on like the Phrygian over here, right? So if I was on the Phrygian, I would call that that it's a PY, right? We would be going from the Phrygian to the Lydian. So you could call that from a modal range, a PY modal range, or a 3-4 modal range. What's the distance between those two? It would be a 1 note away from the Phrygian, which is the first modal half step, which would be the second scale degree, right? And then so what would be the opposite of that? Well, you could say from a modal range system, it would be going from Y to P, right? So I could find the opposite going, okay, that's going to be, let me put another one of these here. Actually, let me use my pen. I'm going to try to get fancy with my pen. I can't see where my cursor went. Here, I'll use the highlighter. So it would be a YP, right? It would be a YP right here. So that's going to be a YP modal range, because now I'm going from the Y back to the P. But remember, if I'm on a YP modal range, I could go forward 11. So that's going to be an 11 note away Y 6 modal half step, which would be the 7th scale degree, right? Similar to the 11 note away major 7. But I can also think of it as I'm going back 1, which would make, because I could be going from the 4 backwards to the 3, 4 back to the 3, which would be a negative 1. So we'll talk about that terminology actually makes sense if you think about it this way. I could have negative directionality. We'll get into that in a future presentation, but I just want to introduce that now. All right, let's go to the next one. So if I can switch this back to okay, let's do the next one. So I'm going to bring this down. So now we've got a 2 note away. So it's a 2 note away. We typically call that a major second, which would mean it would be a major first modal half step. So if we go 2 notes away from the C here, that will land us on a continent. And so what would be the inverse? What if I'm going from this Dorian back to the Ionian? So normally we would call that the inverse, 12 minus 2, which would be 10 notes away, which means I'm not going directionally negative backwards. I would normally think about it as going 10 notes up, and we would say that 10 note up distance is a minor 7. But I would also start to think, and we'll introduce this later again, that the minor 7 could also be thought of 10 notes forward, but also 2 notes backwards. That's how you can add directionality kind of in your mind with these same terms. Now, a little trick to realize here is that when you're looking at the inverse of a minor will be a major. The inverse of a major will typically be a minor pretty much all the time. And the inverse of a perfect will always be a perfect. There's kind of reasons for that. That's a little kind of, again, like a hack type of thing that might help you to understand those or memorize what the inverse is going to be. But what you really want to do is look at the distances and be able to figure out what the distance is and then know the name for those distances. Now that 2 note away is in the Ionian. So if I look at it from the perspective of an Ionian node, we also know that the 2 note, I could go 2 notes up, right, from an Ionian node and land on a continent. I could go 2 notes up from the Lydian node and land on a continent, from the Mixolydian node and land on the continent. So most of the time, because that's a whole step, we can go 2 steps up and still land on a continent is the general idea. So let's just look at it from the Ionian node. We can call that an ID modal range. That would be a 2-1 modal range. What's the distance? It would be a 2 note away from the Ionian node, first modal half step, which would be the second scale degree, right? A 2 note away first modal half step, which would be the second scale degree. The M isn't really important. The 2 is the thing that's important. All right, well, what if I was to reverse that? Then I would be going from I to D. Now I want to go from D back to I. So D to I would be, if I go over here, here's a D to I. So we're going to call that a DI modal range, a 2-1 modal range. What's the distance? Well, we typically think about it going clockwise from this D forward, which would be a 10 note away from the Dorian mode, 6th modal half step, which would be the 7th scale degree. But I could think about it as going backwards from this D negative 2. So again, we'll talk about that. That directionality actually works this way. I could use this same modal range and say, hey, look, I can get there by going clockwise or counterclockwise. And it actually works with this term where it doesn't really work with the other. So we'll talk about that later. So let's go ahead and do the next one. I'm going to see if I can get back here and then here. All right. So now we're going to go to a 3 note away minor third. So if I have a minor third, notice I can't go 3 notes away from the Ionian. That lands me in the ocean. That's why it's a minor. Let's pick a minor node. If I'm on the Aeolian and I go 3 notes away, that lands me on a continent. So okay, what would be the inverse if I went 3 notes away? Now notice it says it's a minor third. If I say I'm going from the Aeolian, that makes me think that that has to be the first, but it doesn't, because the 3 notes away just simply means that it's 2 modal half steps forward. 2 modal half steps forward, or 3 notes away. So I can still keep that as a 6 and count up from there, and that's okay, right? And so I'm going to say, all right, what's the inverse? Well, if I want to go back from the C back to the A, that would be 1, 2, 3, negative 3, but we usually think it's 12 minus 3, which is 9. That would be a 9 note away, which we have to just know is a major 6. Now, so that means that when I go from here to here, I'm thinking about it as though I'm going forward 6. But you can also think that a major 6 also means that I could go back 3, right? A negative 3. So that's what I would introduce in your mind, which we'll talk more about later. But when I'm looking at directionality, I could think about these intervals as either going a clockwise distance or a counterclockwise distance in general. All right, so then we're going to say, all right, is that one is not in the Ionian, right? So we would normally not be measuring that from here. We would often be measuring from something like a minor mode, like let's say a Dorian mode. So from the Dorian mode, we would have a 2-4 modal range, for example. So now I'm on a Dorian here, and I can go 3 notes up to the Lydian, Dorian to the Lydian. That would be a dy modal range, here to here. So a 2/4 modal range. What's the distance? It's a 3 note away from the Dorian mode second modal half step, which would be the third scale degree. A 3 note away second modal half step, third scale degree. The M's not really helping me out much. I'd rather know the node that I'm measuring from. Okay. Well, how would I go the other way? How would I go backwards? Well, it would be a dy. I'd be going from the y back to the d. So the Lydian to the Dorian. So let's find a y d. So it would be over here somewhere. So wait a sec. A y d right there. Boom, 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 boom. So if I went backwards, it would be a yd modal range, a 4-2 modal range, which again, if I'm on this 4, that would normally mean I go clockwise or to the right 9 steps away from the Lydian mode, which would bring me around in a circle to get back to the Dorian. And that would be a 9 note away from the Lydian 5th modal half step, right? But I could also, which would be the 6th scale degree. But I could also say, well, 7 minus 5 would be 2 modal half steps backwards, 1, 2, right? So or 12 minus 9 would be -3, -3 backwards. So this modal range could also allow us to have a term that has distance, again, going forwards and backwards. We'll talk about the backwards name later. All right, let's go to the next one, and I'll go back up here and say the next one, we've got a 4 note away major third. So a 4 note away major third, that is something that's in the Ionian. So because if I go 4 from the C, 1, 2, 3, 4, it lands me on a continent. So, okay. That's great. What's the inverse? Well, it would be 12 minus 4, which would be 8. So if I'm on this E and I want to go back to the 4, we typically think about it as though I'm going forward around in a circle to the 4, 8 notes forward, which is a minor 6. That means that the minor 6, however, you can also think of it as though you could go 1, 2, 3, 4 steps back. So I would start thinking about a minor 6 as either being 8 steps forwards or 4 steps back. That allows you to, again, to have that directionality so you can count from the bottom strings to the top strings of the guitar. But it would be better if we used a term that had that built in, that would be easier to add directionality, like if we have an IP modal range, Ionian to the Phrygian, and then I want to go the other way, what would we call that? Well, that would be, by the way, this distance would be a 4 note away from the Ionian node second modal half step, which would be the third scale degree. So if I went the other way, it would be a PI, Phrygian to the Ionian. So let's look over here. We have the Phrygian to the Ionian, which is right there. So if I went backwards, what would that be? Well, it would be a PI modal range, which I could go clockwise, which would be an 8 note away from the Phrygian node 5th modal half step, which would be the 6th scale degree, or I can go backwards. And the reverse of this would be 5 minus 7, because there's 7, so which would be a -2, right? So I could go back a -2 modal half steps, which would be a -3rd scale degree, but we don't have negative scale degrees going backwards. All right, let's do the next one. Wait, now I just put a dot there. Let's undo this. Okay, go down. So now we have a 5 note away, which we call a perfect fourth. So a 5 note away perfect fourth, if I'm on that, let's take this C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I get up to here. So we land on a continent, of course, if we're in the Ionian mode. What's the inverse? We usually call that a 12 minus 5, which would be a 7 note away, and we have to know that that's a perfect fifth. The inverse of a perfect is a perfect. So the perfects are inverses. Why did that happen? Because the perfect 7th was made perfect instead of major. It should have been called major 7, but they thought it was so cool, and it was such a solid interval that they want to call it perfect, and that means that you have to make the inverse perfect. So obviously that's why the perfects are inverses of each other, because if you make one perfect, you'd have to make the other one perfect, you would think. So then, all right. So, but obviously in reality, we would be going backwards. Now let's say this one is in the Ionian, so I would call that a modal range of a IY modal range, right? I to the Y. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes up, or 1, 2, 3 modal half steps, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4 scale degrees. So an IY modal range is a 1-4 modal range, which is a 5 node away from the Ionian node third modal half step, which would be the fourth scale degree. So what would be the inverse? Well, you'd have a YI modal range. So let's do that. So we're going to go to a wait, now that's the wrong tool, a YI modal range. So here's the Y, here we go, boom. So a YI modal range, a 4-1 modal range, would be a 7 node away from the Lydian mode, and it would be 4 modal half steps if I was to continue going forward. If I was to go backwards, what would it be? It would be, so this would be a 7 node away from the Lydian mode, 4th modal half step, which would be the 5th scale degree. See how that P's not really telling me anything? The 7's telling me something, and then I would rather know the node that I'm measuring from. Otherwise, I can drop it entirely. I can just say it's a 7 node away or 7 node away 4th modal half step or 5th scale degree, right? I don't need, okay. So that means, so that if I was to go backwards, it would be 7 minus 4, which would be -3, right? So I can go back 1, 2, 3 modal half steps, which you would think would be the -4th scale degree, but we don't have -4 scale degrees. That's why I would start to think about this 7 node away perfect 5th as being bidirectional, right? It could either go forward, I'm sorry, we're on this one, a 5 node away perfect 4th, right? You could think of them as going forwards or backwards is the point. I think I kind of messed that up. I'll try to do better next time. Hold on a second. We're going to go, this is going to be a 6 node away. This is the crazy one. The 6 node away diminished 5th, because that's the one right in the middle. It's got that crazy tone to it, right? So let me do everything with this cursor instead of trying to underline it. All right, a 6 note away diminished 5th. So 6 notes away isn't in the key of C. If I go 6 notes, I land in the ocean, right? Almost all the time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from the Lydian, from the Ionian. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the ocean. From the Phrygian. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I land in the ocean. When don't I land in the ocean? Well, the Lydian, but we call that a 4th. So we're going to go to the Locrian, the B, because that's a 5th. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We don't land in the ocean. So let's measure from there. We're going to say, all right, we're going from here and we're going to here. Okay, so that's going to be a 6 note away. What's the inverse? Well, 12 minus 6 is still 6. So you'd still call the inverse a diminished 5th. So that's the weird thing about that tone. It's right in the middle, like right on the clock face, right on the bottom, right? And so if I was to think about that, then I want to think about it kind of like in the Locrian, because that's the only one where you really don't land in the ocean. And that would be a 6 note away, which would be an NY. It would be an NY modal range, which would be a 7-4 modal range, which would be a 6 note away from the Locrian node 4th modal half step, which would be the 5th scale degree. And the inverse then would be a YN, would be a YN. So it would be something like right here. And that, so to go the other way, it would be a 6 note away Y 3rd modal half step or 4th scale degree. Now remember, the 4ths and the 5ths get mixed up because this is 6 notes away that could end up on the 4th or the 5th. It's a weird one, but the point is I could go forward this many steps. Like if you're on the Lydian, it happens to be the 4th modal half step. It happens to be the 4th scale degree, which would be the 3rd modal half step. We'll talk more about that later. There's a weird interval. But I could also go backwards, -1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that means, how can I see that? Well, it would be this 3 would be 7 minus 3, 7, 6, 5, 4. And this 6 would be 12 minus 6 or -6, right? Okay, let's undo this, see if I can undo all of this without doing anything too crazy. Boom, perfect. All right, let's do the next one. And so that was the crazy one. So now we're on a 7 note away perfect 5th. This is the really solid one. So if we go 7 notes away, we can go from our standard Ionian. 7 notes away, we'll land on a continent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So let's say we're going from, not that one, this one. We're going from here to here. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going from here to undo to here. Okay. So that's fine. What's going to be then the inverse of a 7 note away perfect fifth? It's going to be 12 minus 7, which is a 5 note away perfect fourth. So again, we're thinking that we're going 5 notes up instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 notes back. So that means you can think of a perfect fourth as either going 5 notes up or 7 notes back. That's how I would think about it. Now, but if we had a better system, and if I go 7 notes up from the Ionian, it would be an IX modal range, which would be a 1-5 modal range, which would be a 7 note away from the Ionian node, 4th modal half step, which would be the 5th scale degree. The inverse would be an XI modal range. An XI modal range is going to be out here. It's going to be an XI modal range right there. So that, and the XI means that I could either go clockwise or counterclockwise, right? If I go clockwise, I would be going forward another 5 note away from the Mixolydian node, which would be a 3rd modal half step or a 4th scale degree. It would be going forward. If I was going backwards, I can name it as though I'm going backwards to tell you the direction, which would be 12 minus 5 or a negative 7 from the Mixolydian node. 7 minus 3 would be a negative 4 modal half step, which you would think would be a negative 5th scale degree, but we don't have negative scale degrees. That's why you have to think about like this term as though it can kind of go forward or backwards, so you can get directionality into the process so that you can actually look at it directionally. So then let's do the next one. The next one is going to be an 8 note away minor 6. All right, if we go 8 notes away, let's pull this out again. We can't go from the C, because if I go 8 up, do I have enough room? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We land in the ocean. But it's a minor mode, so if I go 8 up, let's say from the Aeolian, let's do this Aeolian right there, and we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We land on a continent. So we can go 8 up from an Aeolian. Or let's actually do one, because that's going to be way on the, we'll keep that. 8 up from the Aeolian. Okay, so what's the inverse? I can go 8, I can go 12 minus 8, which would be 4, which would be a major third. So the inverse of a minor is a major. Now again, that usually means that I'm going to go forward 4 around the circle. But I can see if I'm going from here back to here, I'm actually going negative 8 distance-wise, which is why I would start to remember that a major third could be a 4 note away forward, but it can also be a negative. So I would think by default, you're going to say a major third means 4 notes away. But it could also be negative, and that's when I would say, I would define, look, it's a 1, 2, 3, it's a negative 8 note away major third. Or if it's an octave higher, I would say it's 4 plus an octave, 4 plus 12 note away major third. That'll help you to get better at your directions, right? Otherwise, people get lost. People get lost, all right? I get lost easy. I would appreciate a little bit of more defined directions. Might help me a little bit, okay? That's all I'm saying. If I get lost, it's your direction's fault. That's what I'm saying. All right, so it's an AY modal range, a 6-4 modal range, which would be an 8 note away from the Aeolian node, 5th modal half step, which would be the 6th scale degree. I lost my mouse again. Where did my mouse go? There it is. The 6th scale degree, boom, right there. So if I went the other way then, it would be a YA modal range. YA modal range. So where's the YA modal range, which would be right there, which would be a 4 note away from the Lydian mode, 2nd modal half step or 3rd scale degree, right? Similar to a 4 note away major third. But I also note that I'm not usually going to go forward 3. I could make the inverse, which we'll talk more about, or the mirror inverse, or the negative directional term, which would be 12 minus 4, negative 8 from the Lydian mode, 7 minus 2, negative 5, negative 5th modal half step, which you would think would be the negative 6th scale degree, but we don't have scale degrees going backwards. Problem. Okay, let's do the next one. So now we've got a 9-note away major 6. So a major 6 is going to be in, so here's our C down here. Let's go 9 up from here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Lands me on a continent. Great. So what's the inverse? 12 minus 9, which would be a 3-note away minor third. So the inverse of a major is a minor. The third means I'm going to go up 3. But really, I'm going backwards, right? So I'd like to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 backwards. So a minor third then, I'm sorry, I might have said major. A minor third could be forward 3 notes, but it could also be backwards 9 notes. And notice that that 3 doesn't really help you determine negative directionality, right? It doesn't really tell you how many continents back I'm going. Because again, you can't really take 7 minus 3 to get the negative distance because the 3 is off by 1. It's really 2 modal half steps. It's really 2 modal half steps, and therefore it would be 7 minus 2, right, to go the other way. So this one is in the Ionian, so I could say that it's going to be it's going to be an IA or an Ionian to the Aeolian modal range, which would be our 9-note away Ionian 5th modal half step, which would be the 6th scale degree. The inverse would be an AI modal range. Oh no, we're getting into AI again. We're getting into AI. It's going to be an AI modal range. Here it is. And so an AI modal range is a 6-1 modal range, which would be a 3-note away from the Aeolian node and a 2nd modal half step, which would be the 3-note away minor third, right? But I can also do the reverse because I could say, okay, well, really I'm going backwards, so it should be a negative 12 minus 3 or 9-note away from the Aeolian node, negative 7 minus 2, negative 5th modal half step. See, we can introduce that term, which makes sense. We can't do it with the scale degrees because the scale degrees are off by 1. I can't get a negative scale degree, so all I can do is kind of memorize that the minor third could be going forward 3 clockwise or counterclockwise 9. You just memorize that. Some people, I've heard them use negative scale degrees, but most people don't, and even if you do, it doesn't really make sense like the way you would think it would mathematically, because again, they counted it off by 1. So then let's do the next one. We have a 10-note away minor 7. So a 10-note away minor 7 is not going to be from the sea. I'll land in the ocean. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lands in the ocean. But I could go from the A. Let's go from this Aeolian 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That will land us over here on the G. What's the inverse? It's 12 minus 10, which would be 2, which we just have to know is a 2-note away minor 2nd. But again, that would mean that you're going forward 2 back to the A, and I'm really thinking that I'm going backwards 2, so therefore I would think of, I'm sorry, it's a major 2nd, not a minor 2nd. The inverse of a minor is a major. So I would be going backwards. So the major 2nd you would think could either be forward 2 or backwards 10. So that's how I would think about it. I would say it's a negative 10 minor 2nd, right? If you're going backwards. We'll talk more about that later, but you have to just kind of understand that most people are going to say, if I went from here back to here, they're going to call that, I'm sorry, major 2nd. They're going to call that a major 2nd, even though you're going backwards. And then again, they'll just drop the idea of directionality altogether, which is not helpful, right? Let's go to the Aeolian. If I'm on the Aeolian, we're going to say it's on the Aeolian, and we're going to go from here to here. So it's going to be an AX modal range, a 6-5 modal range, which is a 10-note away from the Aeolian node, 6 modal half step, which would be the 7th scale degree. So what would be the inverse of that? It would be an X XA, it would be an XA modal range. So if I go from the X, I'm going to an XA modal range, which would be here. And that's going to be, what's the distance to go from X to A? Well, normally I would go clockwise or to the right, which would be a 2 node away from the Mixolydian node first modal half step, which would be the second scale degree. But I can also easily do the inverse here. I can easily go backwards, go counterclockwise by taking 12 minus 2 would be negative 10 from the Mixolydian node, and 7 minus 1 would be negative 6. So I can see that I can see directionality would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 modal half steps back, which would be the negative 7th scale degree. I can't do that here because I can say directionality is going backwards if I include the notes, but I can't really say that a second scale degree forward is going to be 2 minus 7 to go backwards, because again it's off and we don't use the scale degrees going backwards. So the whole scale degree measuring tool only works going clockwise basically, but you can kind of work around it by just memorizing the negative distance of a major second. You just have to know that it would be negative 10 backwards. Right? A major second going forward is negative 10 backwards. But if you did it this way, you can derive it easy just using simple directionality math. This is why I think there's a conspiracy that music used to be really kind of logical. Logic was the thing that made people attracted to it. But then they somehow, just to hide the fact that the naming convention is all wacky, convince people that counting is bad or something. I don't know. I'm coming up with a theory here. Anyway, and then we have an 11 note away major 7. So if you're starting on the C and we go 11 away, let's do it from here. Oh, now I lost my mouse again. All right, so we're on this one. So I'm going to say if we're on this C and we go up 11, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, we get to here, which is going to be 7 scale degree, which would be 6 modal half steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 scale degrees if I make that the 1. Okay, what's the inverse? Well, if I know it's 11 notes away, the inverse is going to be 12 minus 11, which is 1, which I know is going to be a minor something, because the inverse of a major is a minor. It's a minor, and we call it a minor second, right? A minor second. You just kind of have to know that. We can see that is in the Ionian node, so I could call it, that's an IN modal range. I would call it an IN modal range, which has a distance of an 11 note away Ionian 6th modal half step, which would be the 7th scale degree. What would be the inverse distance? Well, I would be going from the N back to the I, which would be an NI modal range, whereas the Locrian is way over here, of course. Had to end it off on one way over here. It would be an NI modal range, which would be a 7-1 modal range. So I can get back there by just completing the lap around the block. So why go backwards? I could just go 1 note forward from the Locrian node, which would be 1 modal half step forward, right? I could just finish it going this way, but I'm run out of fretboard. I need to go back the other way. Okay? Well, then I could make a term for that, which would be a negative 12 minus 1, which would be negative 11 from the Locrian node, and 7 minus 1 would be negative 6 modal half steps backwards, which would be the negative 7th scale degree backwards if we used negative scale degrees, but we don't. Most people don't, and that's why it's a problem. So there it is. So again, bottom line, from a practical standpoint, I would start to learn these intervals both with directionality. They have a forward clockwise directionality and a reverse directionality. If I can go forwards to this C, or I can go backwards to this C from here, and I can name that with the same interval. A lot of people don't see it that way, right? But I think that's the clearest way to add directionality into your fretboard thinking, and also just add, so you add the note name, right? I'm going forward this many notes, and the interval, or I'm going backwards this many notes. That also will help you out with octaves, to clarify something that's within an octave to something that's greater than an octave in distance, so that you can count it out.